This is the One Girl Revolution podcast, a podcast that highlights the stories of world-changing women and girls across the country. We hope that these stories inspire you, but even more so, we hope that these stories help you to see your own value, your purpose, and your power to change the world through your life. Every woman and girl is a One Girl Revolution. Welcome back to the One Girl Revolution podcast. It's your girl, Kate, here. I am so honored to share this week's episode with you, featuring an incredible woman who is bold, she's a visionary, and she is a passionate advocate. On this week's episode of the One Girl Revolution podcast, I welcome Robin Steinberg. Robin has spent her entire career fighting for justice and fighting for truth. She is the founder of three groundbreaking organizations, the Bronx Defenders, Still She Rises, and the Bail Project, each one built on her unwavering belief that every person deserves dignity, humanity, and a true defense, no matter who they are or what resources they have. Robin's first big leap came in 1997 when she founded the Bronx Defenders in New York City. Instead of looking at criminal defense as just courtroom battles, Robin pioneered a holistic model, one that addresses the many factors that shape a person's case: housing, health, family, and so much more. Robin then went on to create Still She Rises in Oklahoma, the first public defender office in the country dedicated exclusively to representing women. Tulsa, Oklahoma, a city with one of the highest incarceration rates for women, became the backdrop for Robin's bold vision to support women and mothers caught in the criminal legal system, recognizing that defending them means defending their children, their families, and their communities, and their future, and their children's future. Did you know that 80% of incarcerated women are mothers? Robin shares some really powerful insights into the discussion on women and incarceration and why they are the fastest growing population in jail and prison, and how we can advocate for mothers and babies in the justice system. And then in 2017, Robin launched the Bail Project, a national effort to combat mass incarceration at its entry point, the cash bail system. The Bail Project provides free bail assistance and pre-trial support to thousands of people each year who would otherwise remain jailed simply because they cannot afford bail. The work that Robin does ensures that freedom isn't determined by the size of someone's bank account. Robin has never stopped asking the hard questions. What does true justice look like? How do we defend not just a case, but a person's humanity and their future? And what can we do to create a system and a culture that uplifts rather than destroys? Robin offers so much wisdom and insight into the justice system and pretty much gives us Legal 101 and fills us in on what's going on with the bail system and what's going on with the justice system and how we can all be a part of the solution to change. I am so excited to share Robin's story with you and to share all of the incredible work that she does. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Robin. Robin, welcome to the One Girl Revolution podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you.
I am so excited to have you on. I want to talk all about the incredible work that you do. But before we get into that, I love to rewind in these episodes and hear a little bit about every woman's journey, because I think that there are things in our lives that often point us in the direction. And I know you have that as a part of your story, point us in the direction for where we end up going and who we end up becoming. And so I would love to rewind and hear a little bit about your life and your journey. Rewind to where you're from and give us a little bit of your background and even your career before you got into the Bail Project and all the other great work that you do.
Sure. Thank you. It's funny. I think the straightforward, easy answer, right, is I went to college and majored in women's studies and went to law school thinking I was going to be a women's rights litigator. I was really committed to that idea. And I went to law school and I got there and I found no courses about women at all. And so the only course that law school offered at the time was something called Women in Prison Project, So I barely noticed that prison was part of that sentence, but I thought it's about women. There's a course about women. And so I signed up for it. And what it actually wound up being was a clinical experience where you went up to Bedford Hills Correctional Facility to meet with women who you were advocating for in a variety of ways, whether it was making sure they were getting access to health care or access to visiting their children or appealing their convictions. That was the work we were doing. And so I found myself at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility meeting with some of the women who we were representing that year in law school. And I was so moved by their stories and by what they told me. And I was a little bit overwhelmed by the constant sense that they felt that they had not been given a fair shot in the criminal justice system, that their public defenders didn't really know them or care about them very much. And they all sort of shared a view that they had been railroaded by the system, which got me really interested in what was going on in the criminal justice system. And I hadn't actually thought about a career in criminal justice. So my third year in law school, I joined the criminal defense clinic. And that was a clinic where you represented people on relatively minor charges in Manhattan's criminal court. And I walked into criminal court on that very first day, and I'll never forget it. I was dressed in my very conservative gray suit and my black pumps and my Yes pantyhose, which we all wore back then, and my briefcase, which we then carried. And I walked into criminal court and I looked around and I thought, oh my God, this is what passes for justice in America. I cannot believe what I'm seeing. And that was really driven by the fact that it looked so degrading and dehumanizing, and people were treated so poorly. And that I saw people standing in court who were being charged with things that I knew were happening in every neighborhood in New York, but were really being policed in low-income Black and brown communities in New York. And then I saw the family members waiting in the hall, desperate to see their loved ones just for a moment, and how quickly the proceedings went by. And I had had some idea that criminal justice looked like, brilliant arguments in court and thoughtful judges, rendering thoughtful decisions. And instead, it looked like an assembly line where people were more concerned with people's calendars than they were about the substance of the cases people were charged with. And so I, had two choices at that point, right? You either can throw yourself into the system headlong and decide you want to try to do better, or you can walk away and say, I want nothing to do with this. And that would have been a fine decision too, but I couldn't look away and I couldn't walk away. And so I decided to become a public defender. It's funny when you ask that question about sort of what the road is that you take, that's the easy, straightforward answer. But the older I get and the more that I understand about myself and the world, and you gain perspective, you realize there were probably lots of other factors than what the choice was about what I wanted to do that really influenced my decision to be a public defender. And I think there are two things there. One is I was also a child of the 60s and early 70s. And so I was very much influenced by the political and cultural happenings of those days, right? I was inspired by the civil rights movement. I was inspired by the feminist movement. I was inspired by everything I saw happening around me, and people really passionate about change and making things better. And so I think that was a big influence. And I was an unlikely person to wind up in law school anyway. Frankly, I was an unlikely person to wind up in college. My parents were teenagers when they met. My mom got pregnant when she was 19, and neither of my parents had gone to college. And so I grew up in a pretty unstable, dysfunctional family. My father also developed a very severe drug addiction. And so he was struggling with that while I was growing up. And my mother's attention was very much focused on that as well. And he cycled in the criminal justice system as well. And I share that, which is something I did not share while I was a public defender and while I was doing my career. And I didn't share that for a very particular reason. I didn't want people to think, oh, she became a public defender because she's playing out some psychodrama about her father who she couldn't save. He did die of a drug overdose when he was 49. That's not why I became a public defender. But I will say this, it is what made me, I think, a good public defender, because what I learned from that experience growing up was that you can love somebody and care about somebody and fight for somebody even when they're deeply flawed and even when they do terrible things, that there's more to a person than just that. And so having grow up learning that firsthand by having a parent who was struggling, and a parent who obviously, did some pretty terrible things sometimes, I learned what it meant to really fight for somebody's humanity despite that. And so I think that made me a good public defender, but it's not why I became a public defender.
It's so important for us to look back at our journeys. And I think, like you said, sometimes it's when you're an adult, as we get older, we look back at different facets of our story and we're like, oh, it's kind of a light bulb moment. Like, oh, that's why I cared so deeply. And I'm sure even subconsciously when you set forth your set foot in that courtroom, there were even probably these like kind of subconscious things that you're the little girl that you were, you're seeing these families, you're seeing these children, you're seeing these people from different backgrounds, but almost kind of seeing yourself and being like, okay, I need to advocate for these people in the justice system, and advocate for these families. I'm sure that there were instances where you saw a little bit of yourself in that.
For sure. And I knew the impact that the system had on, not just the person going through it, but their families. And I think it also, I kind of grew up feeling always a little bit like an outsider. And I think that might have had to do with what was going on in my family, sort of behind the curtain. While I was getting up as a girl and going to school every day as if everything was normal, there was nothing normal about what my life was like as a child and as a teenager. And so I think having felt a little bit like an outsider, never quite feeling quite comfortable as an insider, and always sort of rooting for the underdog was sort of the way that I was always, even as a kid. And so I think I carried that with me too, which is when you have a decision about what to do with a law degree, you can fight for the powerful, right? But they have plenty of people fighting for them. Or you can decide you want to use your law degree to right wrongs and use your law degree to fight for people who don't have as much of a voice and people who don't have power, and to stand up for them in the system. And I think that's what I wound up doing. Well, I know that's what I wound up doing.
Yeah, it is. And you continue to do it in new and innovative ways through your life and through your career. And there's so much that I want to talk about, but let's actually start with the Bronx Defenders.
Sure.
Because I think that this is such a great starting point for us. When did that come about? Was there like a spark moment that you were like, we need, you're defending people, you're helping people. But at what point did that come about?
Sure. So I had been a public defender for almost 15 years, when I founded the Bronx Defenders. And I had grown up in two different legal aid society criminal defense offices and learned how to be a really good trial lawyer, learned what it meant to be a public defender, and, worked with some very talented people who cared deeply about the work. And then I went to the Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem, where I was one of the original managing team there, and we were trying something different there. What does it mean to be in a community and fight for a community? And so that office was created in 1989 in Harlem so that we could really focus on a particular community and defend people in the criminal justice system coming from that community. That taught me a lot about what does it mean to fight for a community, understand a community, and understand the context of people's lives in a different way. And then in 1996, the city of New York put out what they call a request for proposals and basically said, we're starting these new offices. That was a whole political infighting in the public defender world that we don't need to get into. But for me at that moment, really, the decision was, well, okay, so the current mayor is about to start these new offices and people are going to be running them in every borough around New York City. And who's going to step into that and who's going to really think about how we might do better for people. And so I put in a proposal to the city of New York with a small group of people who were brilliant and wonderful and my colleagues, and did that with me. And we won a contract to start an office in the Bronx. And what I really wanted to do was take the lessons I had learned from my experience at the two legal aid offices that I worked at, my experiences at the Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem, and really see whether we could do something bigger and bolder and broader and scale an idea that would which was holistic defense, which basically said, public defenders can't just focus on the criminal case that their clients have when they come into the system. There's more to people than just that. And that the systems that interact with low-income people are interacting with them all the time, whether it's immigration or housing or public benefits or family court. And that if you're just focusing on a criminal case, you're missing the broader picture, and you're missing really both where clients need advocacy, but also you're missing the story of their lives. And so holistic defense and the Bronx Defenders really was created to try to dig deeper, understand in a more deep way Our office was located in the community. We had people who were doing, sort of organizing in the community. We really made an effort to understand and stand in the same bodega lines with our clients and understand what their lives looked like as best we could, get as proximate as we could, and then represent them in a different and new and broader way, where our interdisciplinary teams would work with clients in all the different areas they needed work, whether that was any of those court systems or whether it was social work support or social service support, or just something simple like getting your property back once you've been arrested, which gets held by the police department. And it's really hard to navigate how you get it back. But it's really, really meaningful when it is your rent money sitting in the wallet that's locked in a vault and you don't know how to get access to it. And so it really, sprung from that. And then I ran the Bronx Defenders for about 21 years, and it obviously grew from a small office to a very large office. And we continued to really dig deep into what does it mean to provide holistic defense. And eventually we began to teach other public defender offices around the country how to expand their practices to go from sort of a traditional model of focusing on the criminal case only to really expanding what does it mean to represent a whole person? What does it mean to represent them in the different areas of their lives that they need representation? The kind of representation that, frankly, people with money get all the time. If you're charged with a crime and you're wealthy and you go into a criminal defense office and you tell them that your co-op board is throwing you out because of the arrest or your spouse is leaving you because of what's happening, they will refer you to other lawyers who will help you with those issues. And it shouldn't just be the rich people get access to that kind of thoughtful, sort of broad representation, but that low-income people should have access to that too. And that's holistic defense.
For people that are listening, I want to do like a side tangent for a second, Robin, kind of Law 101. As a public defender, I know that every single story, everything is unique, every single story is unique. But for people that are listening, could you kind of explain what that means? Like and kind of how public defense works, like how you end up working with people?
Sure. So, we in America are guaranteed representation if you are facing a criminal charge and there's the possibility that you're going to go to jail. And so Gideon versus Wainwright was the case that a Supreme Court case that established that precedent. And as a result of that case, public defender offices have been set up around the country. And what that means is lawyers who go to law school and graduate from some of the best law schools in the country decide that what they want to do is use their law degree to defend people who don't have access to lawyers. You get assigned your cases by the court system. When people come in and it's determined that they are low income or indigent is how they call it, indigent defense representation, they will assign those people to your office. And your office, the public defender office, will represent them in the criminal system. And that means that you represent people from the very beginning. Sometimes that means you work out a plea bargain. Sometimes it means you go to trial, but you are the lawyer who gets assigned to stand next to that person as they travel through the criminal justice system. And that's what public defenders do every day. I personally think public defenders are what breathe life into democracy and breathe life into our Constitution, because without them, the system would be completely lopsided. Most people coming into the criminal justice system are from low-income communities around this country. That's a whole nother conversation for probably a whole nother podcast about why that's so. But they need public defenders. And so the public defender system really is deeply important to people's lives.
That's so important. And thank you for sharing that, because a lot of times all of us, we think we know so much about the justice system because we've watched Orange is the New Black, or we've seen something on TV, or, some show that some of them obviously have some threads of truth, but unless you've experienced it firsthand, you don't really know. And so
Sure.
I think it's important for our listeners to hear a little bit about that.
I'll say this too, it's, having grown up watching shows like Law and Order, you probably get the perspective that defense lawyers are sleazy, unethical, don't care about their clients, and basically sit like potted plants in the room while their clients get interrogated by the police. That is not the public defender world that I know, having spent 40 years in it. The people that I know that are public defenders are deeply passionate. They care deeply about the work that they're doing. It is a calling, even more than it's a profession in lots of ways for people. And it is work that I think gives you way more than you're ever going to give it. People are like, oh, isn't it exhausting? Wasn't it? It gives you so much back. There is so much transformation that happens when you do that kind of work. You recognize all sorts of things about the system you didn't understand. You recognize all sorts of things about your own privilege you didn't understand. You recognize what it really takes to defend somebody. And it teaches you, and I think, again, this was, the lesson I guess I learned as a child, but that got reaffirmed as an adult being a public defender, which is you're reminded that people are not the worst thing that they've ever done, that they should not be judged entirely by their worst moment or the worst act that they've ever done. And I always say, if you went into the world, if the world went into every day with a public defender mentality, which was to treat people with respect and to treat people understanding that they're not just one moment, that there is a whole world that happened, a whole world of experience that happened before they got to that thing, and that there's all sorts of potential for the future. And so to sort of be less judgmental and more curious about how did this person wind up in this position? How did this person wind up, even if they committed the crime? What happened before? What is the potential for the future after? And to really think about people in a much more, broad and humane way, frankly, the way that all of us are going to be treated. I always think to myself, if I thought about the worst thing I've ever done and I walked into a room and people introduced me as, hi, I want you to meet Robin Steinberg. She did this, and that's all anybody knew about me. I would feel like that's a really unfair characterization of me as a entire human. And so I think being a public defender teaches you to be curious about people. And I think that curiosity leads to compassion. And I think once you go down that road, you can't help but fight for people.
Yeah, your eyes are opened and you have to do something. And we all can experience that in the world where we feel like the world puts us in boxes, right? And we all do it a little bit, right? Where we judge somebody because of their zip code or what neighborhood they live in or where they went to school or what we think their life is or their faith tradition, whatever the thing is, we put people in boxes. And I know that that is such the experience of people who have been incarcerated or people who are going through the justice system where people don't actually know anything about their story. They just judge them and shut them off because of what might be on their record or what they think might be there. And I know I shared with you about our documentary, The Girl Inside, and it was so eye-opening. That experience was so eye-opening to me setting foot in Cook County Jail. But thinking about, we're all one step away from that, right? You think about like friends that you had when you were a teenager, friends that you had in your adult life, and you're like, oh my gosh, all the different instances that I really was one step away from jail or prison. And it a lot of times isn't even, these horrific stories. It's just like somebody, especially when you talk about women, right? Women are the fastest growing population in jail and prison. And it's fascinating to me to learn about it and think about it. But there's always some other motivating factor, right? They're trying to feed their kids or a boyfriend or pimp or husband or whomever partner got them into a bad situation. And then they end up doing time. And so really pulling back the curtain and seeing the humanity of the person and hearing their stories. And I know that you've experienced that so much with the people that you've defended, where it's like, hey, there are so many facets to their story. It's not just, I judge them for what I think that they did. I really want to get to know them.
Yeah, I mean, and to your point, I think people might hear this conversation and they might say, oh, everybody's making excuses for people. And I always say to people, look, I'm a firm believer in accountability, right? People should be held to account for the things that they do and the harm that they cause. That doesn't have to look like destruction. That doesn't have to look like devastation. That doesn't have to even look like prison. It's not about excuses, but it is about context. It's about understanding. It's about everybody has a story and that you can't really mete out justice unless you understand all of those things, right? You can't really get to something that feels like fairness unless you can appreciate what led up to the act, right? If somebody committed a crime and what their potential is for the future. And so, I always try to encourage everybody to say, it's not that people are making excuses. It's that we're really trying to, help you understand that you need to really think more broadly about what does justice look like? What do we want our justice system to mean? Is it just punishment? I don't think most people think that. I think most people think, people should be held accountable and we have hope for the future. But if we don't really get to the humanity of who people are, it's going to be very hard to change the systems.
Yeah, well, you are doing so much work to change the systems. That's a big part of this podcast, right? Is elevating conversations like this just to get people aware of what's going on. And my hope always is with this podcast that people continue to dig and research and learn and follow all the organizations that are on this podcast so they can learn and share information, spread awareness. And so you are doing so much of that, Robin. At One Girl Revolution, we believe every woman and girl has the power to change the world every single day. Through the One Girl Revolution podcast, our short documentaries, and our social media content, we elevate the voices and stories of women and girls who are making history through their lives every single day. Your support helps us continue this mission to remind every woman and girl that she has value, purpose, and the power to change the world. Donate today at onegirlrevolution.com/donate. That's the number onegirlrevolution.com/donate, and help us keep elevating these voices and stories. I want to talk about Still She Rises because I love, like, we're building here because I want to get to the Bail Project, but talk about Still She Rises. What is Still She Rises and how did that come to be?
Yeah. So long after the Bronx Defenders was established and I was its executive director, I got a phone call from the George Kaiser Foundation in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who asked whether I might be willing to come down to Tulsa for a visit to talk to their public defender office there about holistic defense and the work we were doing in the Bronx. And never one to shy away from an adventure. I said, sure. I'd never been to Oklahoma. I frankly had no idea where it was. And so I said, absolutely. I hopped on a plane and went down to Tulsa and met incredible people from, George Kaiser's Foundation, amongst them Amy Santee, who I just adore, who sat down with me and we really talked about what was happening with public defense in Oklahoma and in Tulsa particularly, and their foundation. And she were really dedicated to working with women and families and improving their lives. And we realized that, Oklahoma incarcerated more women than any place in the country at that time. And, something really needed to be looked at about, was there a better way to do representation for women and families? And so after a whole bunch of conversations, we thought, well, what about starting a new public defender office from the ground up that served only women, which, by the way, has never been done. So public defender offices around the country, the majority of their clients are men, the overwhelming majority are men. And you're quite right that the fastest growing population in jails and prisons around the country are women. And so nobody had ever actually opened an office that focused exclusively on what is the experience of women? Why do they come into the system? What's the experience once they're in the system? And what should we be doing better to defend them once they're in the system? And partly that's because 80% of women coming into the criminal justice system are also mothers. So they're caring for minor children. And so involvement in the criminal justice system is going to impact those children also and for generations. And so how do we think about this work when you know that you are working with women who come into the criminal justice system for different reasons often than men? Their experience in the criminal justice system is different than men, and they are also dealing with the fact that they're the primary caregivers and their kids are very likely going to wind up in the care of somebody else. And how do we think about representing them in a different and better way? And so that's what Still She Rises was created to do, was to really look at this issue. We named it after Dr. Maya Angelou's incredible poem, And Still I Rise. That's where the name came from. And so, Still She Rises has grown over the years since I was there. But those 2 years that I spent in Tulsa, setting up and growing Still She Rises with an incredible small group of people, many of whom I brought from the Bronx with me, was a transformative experience for me. And that work, I think, continues to this day. And, we're learning more and more about how to provide the best representation to women possible.
It's so important. And like I said, these conversations are so important because people don't realize that, right? That women, 80%, I just wrote it down, 80% of women who are in the criminal justice system are mothers, and thinking about the layers to that, the facets to that, when they get out, how to, make sure that they can be reunited with their children and getting the support that they need. I know that there are so many facets to that as well. Like once people get out, it's like, how do they find jobs, places to live, all those types of things. And it's so important to me to really elevate these conversations and elevate these organizations. I love Motherhood Beyond Bars, which is a great organization out of Georgia who is doing incredible work to reunite mothers and their babies and make sure that they have that connection, even when they are doing time.
I mean, the other thing, women come into the criminal justice system, and oftentimes it's a result of abuse that they have suffered as they were growing up, whether it's sexual abuse, physical abuse. The overwhelming majority of women coming into the system have experienced that kind of a trauma coming in. Some of them are girls who ran away from that and wound up, getting into the criminal justice system because literally they ran away from home where they were being abused. And so women also come in and they are more often charged with nonviolent offenses than men are. So they come into the system for different reasons. They're charged with different kinds of crimes, and the impact on them and children and their families is dramatically different. And so that just needs to be looked at through a different lens and with a different focus. And that's what Still She Rises is trying to do in Oklahoma. And so that is an incredible group of advocates and lawyers there. And I couldn't be more proud to have, helped start that organization. And I sit on its board still and watch it grow and watch it continue to do its incredible work. And for me, I got to finally marry my desire to work for women and feminism with my love for public defense. So it was a perfect experience also.
Yeah, I love that too, where it's like at some point in life, all the connections come together, all the roads meet. And I know that that's really what happened with Still She Rises, in your own story. And I know that Still She Rises is such a beacon of light to the rest of the country. Robin, so the reason that I first found or stumbled upon you in your story was because of the Bail Project. So
Mhm.
talk to me about the Bail Project. How did it come to be? And was there a spark moment or a series of moments that happened that led to the Bail Project?
Sure. So, you can't be a public defender for more than a day without recognizing that bail is a critical thing that will impact what happens to your client's case. And here's what I mean by that. So when you get arrested, you are brought into the system. And the first thing that happens is you appear in front of a judge or an administrator, and you see what the charges are against you, and cash bail gets set. What that means is a judge says you have to pay this amount of money while your case is pending, right? Or you're going to have to stay in jail while the case is in the system. What's important to recognize is that money gets set at the very beginning before any evidence has been brought to court, before you've had your day in court, before you've had a trial, before you've even been allowed to speak. A judge will set an amount of cash bail that you have to pay. So the obvious problem is if you don't have money to pay that bail, you can't get out and be free and work with your lawyers and go to your job and be with your family while your case is going through the criminal justice system. It takes anywhere from a couple weeks for a case to get from beginning to end to a few years for a case to finish up, depending on where you are and what the charge is. So you could be sitting in jail if you can't pay your cash bail for weeks, months, or years. And that happens to millions of people every year in this country. So being a public defender, you saw the impacts of that, because what happens is your client who doesn't have enough money to pay for bail will turn to you and say, I can't pay the bail money. And you're like, well, okay, then they're going to take you to jail until we can resolve this case. And understandably, your client will say, do whatever you can do to get me out of here. I'll plead guilty. I didn't do it. I'll plead guilty anyway. Just get me home. To most people, that seems counterintuitive. Most people will say, oh, nobody would plead guilty to something they didn't do. To them, I say, spend 24 hours in a jail in America, and you will do anything to go home. And so people will plead guilty day in and day out all day long because they know they can't pay their cash bail, right? And so they can't fight their case. Even when the public defenders, I remember standing next to clients going, please don't plead guilty. You didn't do this. I know we can beat this case. And they'd say, like, Robin, I cannot spend one more day in jail. Just get me a disposition. And so people will plead guilty. Judges will let them go home. And so that system has, cash bail has corrupted the system in that way. And I use that word, but it sounds like a strong word, but what it really means is we've lost our ability to really determine, whether somebody's guilty or not guilty, whether there's evidence or not evidence, because it has become a system of plea bargaining where people just plead guilty day in and day out because they can't pay their cash bail. So, and if you're in jail, not only are you subject to the terrible, scary, violent conditions of a jail, right? But you also, your life outside is falling apart. So you're losing your job, you're getting thrown out of school, your family's getting evicted, you're losing your home, your pet is without care, your kids don't have care. And so people will do anything to go home. And so what I realized was that decision about setting cash bail was having this enormous impact downstream on people. And in some ways, it was the most important moment in a case when nobody knew anything about anything, but cash bail was being set. So while we were at the Bronx Defenders, we set something up called the Bronx Freedom Fund. It was a very small revolving bail fund. And we decided, let's see what would happen if we posted people's bail. It's also important to, and I'm sorry, it's a little bit of a long story, but the reason the bail was created originally was with the idea that the cash money that somebody paid up front would provide and create an incentive for them to come back to court. And I guess the underlying belief was if people didn't have skin in the game, they wouldn't come back to court. But nobody ever really tested that on scale. So we got a donation and started something called the Bronx Freedom Fund. It was a tiny revolving bail fund. And we began to bail out our clients at the Bronx Defenders using this fund, which was a separate entity, and see what would happen. And frankly, I didn't know what was going to happen. Completely possible that people wouldn't come back to court. I had no idea. But what we learned was, collecting the data over years, is that 95% of our clients came back for every single court appearance, even though they had no skin in the game. They didn't put any money up. What was more shocking was when we paid the bail, over half the cases in New York, in Bronx, got dismissed, which meant that they never should have been in the system to begin with, but you wouldn't know that had they been sitting at Rikers Island on bail, because they likely would have pled guilty to go home. So we began to see, wow, this is really interesting, and kept doing that work. And then one day I got an email, a random email from somebody I didn't know. This is a lesson for your listeners, which is when you get those random emails that sound interesting, don't ignore them. I mean, establish that they're real people, but don't ignore them. And so I wrote back. And this person said, I'm doing some research and I'm curious about the work you're doing at the Bronx Freedom Fund, and was wondering if I could learn out more. And I said, sure. And she and I began a dialogue, and her name was Danielle. And turned out she worked for the TED Company. And TED Company was running something called the Audacious Project. And what that was they had a group of funders who would come together. They were anonymous, and I didn't know who they were. And they were looking for ideas that they thought, if it was funded, could you scale it and have greater impact? And so they encouraged me to apply for the Audacious grant, which I did. And we put in a proposal to take the work that we were doing at the Bronx Freedom Fund and expand it nationally, and create a national not-for-profit called the Bail Project that would actually provide bail assistance to low-income people who needed it, and would connect them to social services that they needed or wanted, and to look at what do people really need to ensure they get back to court. And so what we learned in the Bronx, but we weren't sure that it would apply to other places. What does it look like in rural Oklahoma? What does it look like in Chicago? What does it look like in Montana? What does it look like in Florida? We didn't really know whether what we were learning in the Bronx would actually show the same results if we scaled this nationally, but we knew it was worth it. Because at the end of the day, what we knew is the cash bail system in America has to change. It can't be that we think that if you have enough money, you get to be free to fight your case. And if you don't have enough money, you have to sit in a jail cell. I don't think when you ask most Americans, when you explain that's how cash bail works, almost everybody says, well, that's not fair. Money shouldn't determine who stays in and who goes home, right? It shouldn't be wealthy people get to go home and poor people have to stay in jail. That's not what our system was intended to do before there's been any evidence at all. And that's not what equal justice under the law means. And so we spread the concept. We started the Bail Project in the fall of 2017. We launched to, I think, over 20 cities across the country very quickly. And began to collect the data, began to collect stories of people, began to really look at what are the impacts of cash bail in these different places, red states, blue states, urban environments, rural environments, like what were the things we could learn? And what was shocking was how similar it was to what we'd learned in the Bronx, which was that our clients at the Bail Project come back to their court appearances over 90% of the time. The things that get in the way of coming back to court are generally things like you haven't gotten notification of your next court date, or you lack transportation to get there. So we knew at the Bail Project that if you provide those two things, people will come back to court because they know it's in their best interest to come back to court. And the truth is, the myth that the whole system was built on, which is nobody will come back to court unless they put money up front and have skin in the game, turns out to be a myth. Turns out people come back to court because it's in their best interest to come back to court. And so if they have proper notification, if they have transportation to and from court, and you can help connect them to services they might need, people come back to court. What we also saw was, depending on the jurisdiction, again, huge number of cases get dismissed. Anywhere from 20% in some jurisdictions, as high as 70% of cases get dismissed once we pay the bail in other jurisdictions. And so the same lessons we learned in the Bronx held nationally. And so the Bail Project continues to provide bail assistance to people in different jurisdictions across the country. Their teams on the ground do interviews, determine who's eligible, and pay people's bail with, frankly, philanthropic donations. So nobody has skin in the game. And then they give them text messages for about court date reminders, help provide transportation when they need it, connect them to social services that they request. And so that work continues while we're still collecting the data and while we're still trying to inform better policies around pretrial justice and eliminating our reliance on cash bail.
That's so much information, but so important for us to know because we don't really know or hear much about bail. And so people are like, oh yeah, like they should have to pay bail, but explaining it in that way and thinking about it from like the holistic approach to it as well, where it's not just you pay the bail and then they're cool to leave. It's like, no, we actually focus on the person and helping make sure that they have reminders and that they know what's going on. And if they need other resources and they need other support, we're able to step in or connect them, right, with other organizations or other groups that can support them.
Well, the real, I think, also misunderstanding about bail is that somehow bail is about safety. And that, I think, is the thing that we really need to grapple with generally around this conversation, because cash bail gets set having nothing to do with safety, right? It's not about a determination about who might cause danger in a community and who won't. It simply happens at the very beginning of a case. So what we want to do is get at safety and community safety and ensuring that people, when they come home, might not commit harm again. Then we need to have a system that looks at that, but not how much money is in your bank account. And I think the idea that somehow cash bail is what makes us all safer, if that were true, we'd be the safest country in the world. We are certainly not, but we are the number one incarcerator of our own population in the world. And that hasn't made us any safer. So we really need to sort of reassess, what are we doing? How are we doing it? And could we do it better? I would argue that, eliminating cash as the thing that determines who stays in and who goes home in the pretrial context is a big step forward. And then the question is, what kinds of system do we create where there is a fair, open, transparent process to determine, right, who needs to be held in jail because they might pose a real danger to somebody in the community, and who gets to go home. And I would certainly mention, for 40 years in the system, that it should be the unusual, more rare exception where people need to be held in jail pre-trial when they're given proper supports. But that really is the debate I think that we need to be having, and to, really understand that cash bail has nothing to do with public safety.
Yeah, it's so important for us to know that and be thinking about that and learning from that. And I want to get into your book, but before I do, I want to ask you about stories. So this podcast is all about stories, and we can talk about these topics and these issues all day long, but really to illustrate for people the power of the work that you're doing with the Bail Project and really all the work that you've done throughout your entire career. Is there a story or two that you can share that really illustrates the power of your work?
Yeah, I mean, there are thousands of clients and thousands of stories I could tell you, both about the work to explain the work and about the things that my clients and those experiences taught me. But I think one story really comes to mind where I saw lots of these things happening and really understood both the powerful impact that good public defense can have and how important, bail is at that very beginning decision-making process about whether you can or can't pay bail. I was sitting at my desk and I had been a public defender for about 12 years, I think, at the time. And I got a call that somebody was being brought into the Bronx criminal court who was being brought in on a warrant from another state on a murder charge. And, all sorts of images come to your mind when you see that there's a murder charge, even when you're a public defender. And so I, got my briefcase, put on my shoes, left and went over to the courthouse to await the person they were bringing into the courthouse. And I went into the back where there are jail cells behind every courtroom. And it's a very loud, cold, it's everything you imagine. It's concrete, it's steel bars, it's noisy. There's fluorescent lights that are flickering. The lights never go off. People are shouting, corrections officers are yelling, people being held in the jail cells are sitting in these little cells together. And I remember walking in and asking for my client, and the officer leading me down the hall to this small little dingy jail cell. When I looked in, and there was one person sitting in it, and he was a child. I mean, he was a teenager, and he was sitting alone. And my breath was taken away because he looked so young. And I introduced myself, and I had the complaint in front of me. I knew he was charged with a murder. And I sat down with him and I began to talk, and I did what most public defenders do, which is introduce myself. I told him, I was there to defend him. I told him what he was charged with. And I will never forget, he had been sitting on the bench. He was reading a book. And he sat down at the table with me and he put down the book and he looked up at me and he said, "It's okay. I know I'm going to go to prison for the rest of my life." And it broke my heart into a million pieces because to me, this was a child sitting in front of me. He was a teenager. And I thought to myself, oh, no, you're not. Like, I'm going to find out what happened, how it happened, and do the best I can here. And we went out in front of the judge and I made a bail application that he be released to the custody of his family. The judge said $100,000 bail, inconceivable amount of money. Right. For this family, for sure. For most families in America who don't even have $400 in a savings account, most Americans. And so, I reached out to somebody that had said to me a long time ago, if you ever need my help with a case or a client or there's something I can help with, let me know. And it was somebody who worked on Wall Street. And I called him up out of the blue and I just thought, you know what, I'm just going to go for it. And I explained the story. And I said, there's this young man. I'm convinced there's a story here. I'm convinced he shouldn't have to go to prison, but I'm never going to be able to fight this case and learn all the things I need to learn if he sits in on bail. And he never met the young man. He never came to the jail to meet him. He just wanted to make a difference. And one of those moments, I think, people sometimes just want to make a difference. And he paid his $100,000 bail. And now, what people need to know is the money comes back to you at the end of the case, assuming you come to your court appearances. And I began to get to know this young man and his family. And what I learned was he was living in a home where his stepfather had been violently abusing and beating his mother regularly. And on the night of the shooting, his stepfather had broken into the apartment through a window in the pitch black. And he got up in the middle of the night and he took a gun that the family had in the closet and he shot him dead. And I could never have gotten to that story or understood what happened if he had not been out and I had been able to get to know him and his family and work side by side with him. So we gathered all the information and, I was lucky enough to work at a well-resourced public defender office that had investigators and social workers and public defenders working on teams together. who put together a package, and we went to the prosecutor and to the judge and we explained what had happened. And what this really was defense of a third person, right? There's self-defense and then there's defense of a third person. And this young man believed that the only thing he could do to protect his mother was to shoot his stepfather. And that is, in fact, what he did. And so on the day we went to court and presented everything, I'll never forget it. And the prosecutor and the judge made a decision that this young man shouldn't have a criminal conviction and shouldn't have to go to jail. And we stood in the courtroom, and the prosecutor offered us a case disposition that resulted in everything being sealed. He didn't have to go to jail. He didn't have a criminal conviction. And I'll never forget the moment when the decision was, authorized by the judge and rendered. And his mother began to weep, and his family embraced him, and I began to cry. We walked out, and I thought to myself, I'm a public defender and I sit in this system every day and I see injustice every day. But when a prosecutor is willing to really listen and really, again, understand the story, what was happening before, what happened in, and what the potential for this young man is in the future, and a judge was willing to endorse that, that's what looked like justice. And when that happens, it's a beautiful, incredible thing. It doesn't happen enough. It rarely happens, quite frankly, in the system as it exists. But when it does, it's magnificent. And all of us could be proud of our criminal justice system. And that story really resonates with me still to this day, because that young man grew up, got married, had a family, had children of his own who he raised, moved out of state, started a business, ran a business of his own, and, lived a glorious, productive life where he gave back to his community all the time. And I never forgot that story, because it reminds me of, when you see a charge or when you see something, dig deeper, be curious, find out what's underneath that before you make judgments, before you yell about accountability and punishment. And it also highlighted for me the critical nature of cash bail, because had I not been able to find somebody who was willing to put that money up and had that good soul who just wanted to lend a hand, not been so willing to do that, I think the results might have been very different. I wouldn't have been able to do the work I was. He would have sat in jail for a long time. And frankly, the trauma of the experience of being in jail and prison would have impacted him for the rest of his life in a very negative way. And his family would have done that time alongside him. And so it's a good story in a system that doesn't have a lot of great stories, but it's one that I think is inspiring for all the right reasons. And I hope it inspires prosecutors and judges and people to become defenders and people to, donate to bail project and bail funds, so somebody else can have a fair shake at defending themselves too in the system.
Yeah, that is such a powerful story, Robin, like you said, because it shares all of the facets of the work that you're doing and really helps illustrate for people the power of what the Bail Project is doing and the power of public defenders, right, who are really just trying to get to the bottom of what happened and like, why did this happen? And being able to see these individuals as human beings and being able to get this kid out in order to really dig down into the truth. Because I'm sure if he was in jail, it would be really hard to get him to share, the authentic story and the truth of what happened. So it really does illustrate the power of what you're doing.
Yeah, for sure. And look, I understand that, when people think about people coming into the criminal justice system, or they hear about something on television, or they watch one of those awful, crime drama shows, right? It provokes a kind of fear reaction in all of us. And fear is as human an emotion as anything, right? Probably the most instinctive thing we have is fear, right? It was evolutionary, right? It was flight or fight. It was one of the two. And so fear is a big driver. And I think fear is a big driver of how we wind up with policies that don't make a lot of sense in our criminal justice system. It's also sort of a criminal justice system, we tend to create policy around the exception, which I don't think we do in any other area of our lives, right? It's like the most dangerous thing you do every day is get into your car, right? And if you looked at the data, that's a dangerous thing to do. And yet we get into a car because we know the odds are still in our favor. It's in criminal justice, for whatever reason, and I do believe it's because it really triggers something deep in us, a fear of being hurt, of a protective nature for ourselves and our families and the people that we love, that we just aren't able to move through that fear to really get to a rational thought process about what is a good policy? What is fairness? What is justice? How do we determine it? And to keep ourselves from being driven by the constant narrative of fear. And frankly, opponents to progress in the criminal justice system play on that fear all the time, right? They use language that is meant to provoke fear. They put up pictures of people with mugshots that look really scary. And I really want to encourage people to look through that, get past that, move through your fear. But you're only going to do that if you're willing to be curious, right? And you're willing to sort of think about, okay, I'm afraid, that's normal, that's natural. But let me actually ask the next question, right? So I'm always the weird person that when something comes up on a news story and everybody I'm sitting around goes, oh my God, that's horrible. May very well be horrible. But I'm always like, what's going on that happened? Who is that person? How did they get to this moment? And people always look at me like, what? And I'm like, aren't you curious? Don't you want to understand how this happened, right? How are we ever going to get it right, get it better, make a better world if we're not curious about that? And if we don't see ourselves in other people, if we don't see a shared humanity in other people, no matter what they're charged with, or recognize that our children, we can see in their children. I think until we get there, it's going to be very hard to change our systems. I have to say that after 40 years, I keep thinking the answer is good public defense. The answer is an office that just represents women. The answer is the bail project. And those are incredible projects that do really impactful work and make a difference. And so there has to be changes in policies and laws and practices. But something deeper has to change in all of us, right? And that is really to be able to find that place in ourselves where we can have compassion for other people who we might otherize or demonize or wag our finger at or judge, but instead be more curious and see ourselves as part of the same community of humanity. If we're really going to change these systems. And I think it's one of the reasons, I'm like, what do I have to do what do we have to do to make this better? And so in some measure, I think the place I've wound up in my life is we also have to look within ourselves, and we have to really ask ourselves, why do we think the things we think? What is that being driven by? And how can we do better for our neighbors and, community members?
Yeah, and to be curious, I love what you said, Robin. I'm the same way where I see a news story and I'm like immediately online, like, okay, what actually happened? Connecting
Right.
the dots, looking at other news sources, especially as somebody who works in PR and media. I'm always like, okay, I'm not just going to take one reporter's take on it. Who else has something to say? What was posted on social media? And that curiosity is so critical in our world. And I think that if we really focused on that, not just about the criminal justice system, not just about our particular topic or issue, but about all things, seeing other people and just being curious. Why do they believe what they believe? And why do they care so deeply about that? Or why did they post that on social media? Or why? Asking questions is
Yeah.
so important.
And can't we just talk to each other about it, right? I think about it as a line. I think about, you get through your fear, you lean into curiosity. Curiosity will inevitably lead to compassion, right? And compassion doesn't mean excuses. It doesn't mean not holding people accountable, but it means walking alongside somebody and really understanding them as best you can, get as proximate as you can to them. And that compassion will lead to action. And that action will lead to justice. And justice just leads to love. And that sounds corny, but I genuinely believe it. And it's funny for me, screaming from every possible pulpit I ever had about the injustices of the criminal justice system, that all these years later, I wind up thinking, oh, in the end, it's about justice and love. And that sounds naive, but it's not. And for people out there that might hear and say, well, that's just naive. I also want to say that, 1 out of 2 Americans have had an immediate family member booked into a jail cell at some point. And so if you think this just affects other people, them, the others that you want to not think about, I promise you, people that you don't know these stories, but I promise you their lives have been affected by the criminal justice system too. And that every time a prosecutor gets up in a courtroom across America, in the thousands and thousands of courtrooms, and says, I'm here for the people of the state of, and I'm asking for this. They are speaking on our behalf. And so what justice looks like and what our system looks like is a reflection on each and every one of us. And we can just do better than we're doing.
We can all do something. And that's what this podcast is all about, where we want to encourage everybody to learn more, to be curious, to ask questions, but also just to elevate these conversations. And so, Robin, you were just so amazing and are full of so much wisdom and experience, right? Like you've lived this. And so I'm so grateful to be hearing from you. I said before that you have a book, but you actually have two books. So I want to talk
True.
about The Courage of Compassion and The Bail Trap, which The Bail Trap is your more recent book. For people that are listening, maybe give us a quick, a little brief overview of each book and maybe one takeaway from each of them for our listeners.
Sure. So the first book was The Courage of Compassion. I'm lucky enough to have a co-author on both books, Camila Ramirez, who is a colleague, another social justice person, and somebody who I adore. And so we wrote both these books together. The Courage of Compassion was really looking back at my career over 40 years and really asking the question we've been grappling with during this podcast, which is, why don't these systems change, and what is it we can learn? And so in that book, I tell stories of some of the lessons my clients have taught me during the course of my career about the criminal justice system, about their lives, about what justice looks like, but also really looking at what's driving our criminal justice policy. And as I said, I think that's all rooted in fear. And how do we get beyond that fear so that we can actually see in each other our humanity and our shared connection, and move from just being judgmental to really asking ourselves the deeper questions. And so that book is really, I mean, the one takeaway is, I think what I've already said, right, which is instead of being judgmental, be curious. When you're curious, you're going to get closer. When you get closer, you're going to be more compassionate. When we're more compassionate, we're going to have a better world. We're going to have a better life. We're not going to deny ourselves the deeper experience of getting to know each other and understanding each other in a better way, no matter where we live, what our politics are, where we come from. It sort of is a sort of a meditation on not just the criminal justice system, which I think is the most extreme example of how we otherize people and how we banish them away. So it's really an invitation to stop otherizing each other and lean into real conversations, lean into real understanding, and be brave about, talking to people who are different than you or hold different beliefs or have a different experience, so that we can all work together and make the world better. And so that book was really sort of a culmination of, my career and looking back and really trying to grapple with, there is no one answer. Unless we change ourselves, we're never going to change the systems. The systems are going to continue to be violent and cruel and dehumanizing and degrading, because we haven't really done the hard work of asking ourselves, why do we lean on punishment and cruelty and judgment instead of curiosity and compassion and justice? And so that's really the invitation there. The second book, which is coming out this year, is called The Bail Trap. And really what that came from, being at the Bail Project and starting the Bail Project. Camila was one of the people who helped start it in that original group. And, what we realized as we did our work over the course of many years was that most Americans don't really understand how bail operates and how the cash bail system operates, and how it's not about safety, but the cash bail is unnecessary. It's unfair. And it has really deep, disparate impacts on people who don't have resources, and that just, corrodes the system. And so what we wanted to do is write a book that doesn't tell people what to do or what to believe. Again, the book is an invitation. It is really, this is how the cash bail system operates in America. This is where it came from. This is what it was designed to do. This is the influence the bail bond industry has had on our cash bail system. That's a whole interesting conversation. We're the only place in the world that has a private bail bond industry other than the Philippines, and the impact that has had on keeping cash bail intact, even though we know it's not necessary and unfair. And so the book really lays that out with the hope that what we can do is everybody can be on the same page to understand how cash bail operates in America And then we can have a debate about what should happen once cash bail is eliminated. But you can't have a conversation about cash bail and eliminating it or not eliminating it without understanding it, right? And so it really is an invitation to say, here's how it operates, here's what it is, here's where it comes from, and now let's have a real debate. Obviously, Camilo and I both believe that cash bail is unnecessary and unfair, and that we can do better, and that our pretrial justice system has to find a way that's better than the size of your bank account to determine whether or not you should be in jail before you've had a trial or not be in jail. And so we give some suggestions at the end of the book, but the book is really an invitation to have a conversation about this. And to inform ourselves and to talk about this issue around kitchen tables, so that we all begin to understand it better, so we can come up with way better solutions that look more like justice than what we have now.
I will put the links to both books, obviously all the organizations, so people can easily follow everything that's going on with you, with your books, with the organizations. And we'll continue to follow everything that you're doing, because I want to stay in touch with you and obviously continue with your journey and promote anything that you have coming up and anything that you have going on. 5 years ago, we released The Girl Inside, an Emmy-nominated short documentary that tells the powerful stories of women incarcerated within Cook County Jail. This film follows Dr. Laura Biaggi's life-changing course, Storytelling as a Healing Art, and reunites her with 5 of her former students for one unforgettable day, a day that revealed the power of our voices, our stories, and the resilience within every woman. The Girl Inside is a reminder that every woman and girl matters, every voice matters, and that hope can be found even in the darkest of places. I'm Kate Milligan, founder of One Girl Revolution, and I invite you to celebrate the 5th anniversary of The Girl Inside. Watch The Girl Inside now on YouTube or at onegirlrevolution.com, and please share this powerful short documentary with everyone you know to elevate this inspiring story and these incredible women's voices and their stories. Robin, I'm so curious to know from you, when you think about the Bronx Defenders, when you think about Still She Rises, and when you think about the Bail Project, where do you hope that they go from here? I know that they've grown and evolved in so many ways. Where do you hope that they go from here? And what impact do you hope that these organizations and your story can have on the world?
So, I couldn't be more proud of all 3 organizations and the new leadership in all 3. And so that, there is nothing better than that. It's like raising your kid and sending them off to college and watching them find their person and, grow up is fantastic. That's kind of how I feel about these organizations in the same way. I am inspired by the new leadership and the new generations of leadership that are leading all 3 of these organizations. I think, where I hope that they go is that they continue to be the kinds of organizations that dig deep, that are willing to question their own assumptions, that continue to learn, that they're learning organizations that are continually changing and evolving and growing and reevaluating when they've gotten something wrong and celebrating when they've gotten something right. I think what keeps any not-for-profit, impactful and relevant and important is that willingness to really look back at why you were created, what you were trying to do. Did you get it right? Did you get it wrong? How can we do better? And to ask ourselves those questions all the time. And I'm convinced that all 3 of those organizations have leaders in place that are doing just that, that will continue to have impact for individuals coming through the criminal justice system, but also will develop new leaders in their organizations. When you get to my point in life and you get to my point in my career, what you really recognize is the leadership lanes that you create for people is as critical as any work you did and as impactful as anything you did on behalf of clients. That new leaders are going to take the mantle. They're going to move forward. They're going to have new perspectives and interesting ideas. So I want those organizations to, I always tell them, stay flexible, pivot when it requires pivot, be reflective, and be willing to change. Be willing to readjust when you see something that you did that you thought was right, and now you realize, what, maybe we had that wrong. Let's do it this way. I think that's what makes us all better people, and certainly makes for healthier organizations. And in a perfect world, the Bail Project would be able to put itself out of business. In a perfect world, public defenders would go out of business because we would have better solutions to crime other than, incarceration. But, that's for a very long time in the future, I suspect. But I guess, when I sit back and think, what's my dream? It's that none of these organizations need to exist anymore. And that everybody can go off and decide what they want to do next. I probably won't say that in my lifetime, but it's a dream I hold.
You never know. It's a wild world that we live in, Robin.
It's
And
true.
I think that it's so incredible what you've accomplished and what these organizations have accomplished. And I can't wait to see where they go from here. For people that
Thanks.
are listening, I know that you mentioned donations, and I know that those are important. And you also mentioned curiosity, right? Being curious about individuals and people and their stories and incarceration and, digging into this topic more. For people that are listening, how can they support the great work of these organizations?
hmm So I'd say there's a bunch of things that people can do, right? Clearly, you can write a check, right? The Bail Project has a revolving bail fund, and they still pay bail. They've paid bail for over 35,000 people across the country. They continue to do that work while they try to change policies and practices and jurisdictions to make them more fair, and to work with other stakeholders and elected officials to think about how we might do better. So that's one way you can do it, by donating. You can volunteer, your skills and your services. You can spread the word. Have these conversations with people, have these conversations with relatives over the Thanksgiving dinner, who might not want to hear about the criminal justice system or how bail operates or why public defenders are critical for our criminal justice system and the people that they defend. But, have those conversations, really educate yourself about it and be willing to share the information so we all know more about our system. Get as proximate as you can. Go sit in a criminal courthouse. I always say that to people, like, I was that young law student that stepped into a criminal courthouse and looked at what I saw and learned everything I needed to learn to know what I needed to do. Public courtrooms are available to you. Criminal courthouses are public. You're allowed to go sit and watch. And when you do, I promise you'll want to do more. Do that. Educate yourself on things that are on the ballot that have to do with criminal justice. Know who your judges are. Know what their policies are. Know who you're voting for in your district attorney race. Know what policies they have. Hold people accountable to the policies that they follow through on, and whether it looks like justice. So really educate yourself too. I think it's really, really important for people to know sort of more about what's happening in our criminal justice system. Turn off Law and Order, for heaven's sake. That's not really real. And go spend time with a public defender. Go spend time in a criminal courthouse so you begin to really get, an idea. And I would say also to people, think about hiring people with criminal records. If you think about the fact that 1 in 2 Americans have had a family member booked into a jail cell, people walk around with criminal records in their past. And that doesn't mean that they aren't going to be the most astoundingly fantastic people that you have ever employed in your life. That was certainly my experience at the Bail Project. We hired people with criminal records and who were formerly incarcerated, who became leaders in the organization. And in fact, David Gaspar, who runs the Bail Project, was formerly incarcerated, and he's a brilliant leader and, is doing incredible work. So, think about that too. Think about being willing to hire people who might have made a mistake, and have a criminal record, and bring them into your company or to work with side by side. That will make a big difference too.
We can all do something. And I love that you brought that up because it's so important for us to think about what are we doing in our life that we can open a door for someone or open a door for a conversation. So it's just, you're such a beacon of light, Robin, and I'm so grateful to know you. I'm curious to know if you could get to the very root of why you do what you do and why you care so deeply about this issue and these stories and these people. What would you say that root is?
I can't stand unfairness. It makes my blood boil. It always has. I don't know where that comes from or how deep that goes, but it has always been there. And so I think everything I've done, the work that I've done, is really just trying to make the world a little more fair, a little more kind, and a little more just. But it's that just unfairness. I can't stand seeing it, and I don't like to walk by it. And I think that the roots are probably very deeply there.
Well, you are amazing and you're such a beacon of light to all of us. And I know that people have enjoyed listening to our conversation. I wanted to have you on, Robin, because you truly are a one girl revolution. You're changing the world every single day. But I'm so curious to know, who is a one girl revolution in your life? Who is a woman or girl that inspires you?
So I don't have one person. I don't know what that says about me, but I don't have one person.
That's a
That
good thing. That's a good thing. There are so many one girl revolutions in our lives.
I mean, exactly, right. But I will say this. I think the firsts always inspire me the most, right? The first woman to do something in a field that previously really prevented women from getting into it, the first woman to run for office, the first woman to go into space. Like, firsts are really inspiring to me, because I know how hard that is. I know how much courage it takes. I know how much pushback you get. And I know how scary it can be a trailblazer like that. So it's women who are the firsts in anything that they're doing that I'm most inspired by, and give me the courage and inspire me to keep doing the work I do.
You are such an inspiration and you are a first in so many ways in my mind. And I think that it's so important for us to look at women throughout history, but also women every single day are making history, right? And so to
For
look for
sure.
those firsts that we know and those one girl revolutions in our lives and support them and share with them and tell them, if we can, if we know them, tell them that they are an inspiration to us and support their work. So
Yeah.
Robin, the last question that I always end this podcast on, and I'd like to ask you, if you could leave women and girls around the world with one message, what would it be?
It would be build resilience. And here's why. No matter where you come from, what the resources are you have or don't have, the privileges you have or you don't have. Life is going to throw something in your way, in your path, in front of you. It's going to create an obstacle. There's going to be a challenge. Something's going to happen. And it's going to require resilience to move through it and keep going and get to where you want to go. And so, as much as I would love to say, follow your heart and follow love and follow your dreams, I think that's not possible if you don't build resilience, to get to those places. And I want every woman and every girl to be able to get to those places if they can. But what I really think is that every woman and girl has to build resilience, and that's probably the most important thing, to get to where you want to get.
Women and girls are so inspirational and they are so resilient, looking at these stories. And I love this podcast and I love so many of the people that you're working with too, that have these stories that they've been through hell and back, but they've risen to the occasion and now they're helping other people and using their story to help other people. And yeah, I love to see it. I love to see it in our world. So Robin,
Yeah.
you are such an inspiration. You're such a gift. Thank you so much for all that you do. Thank you for all that
Thank
you
you.
are. And thank you for being on the One Girl Revolution podcast.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me and having me on for this great conversation. And thank you for the incredible work you're doing, and for every woman or girl you have brought onto this podcast to inspire other women and girls to be part of the revolution. So I really appreciate being invited on, and I appreciate the work you're doing as well. Thank you, Kate, very much.
For more from One Girl Revolution, to listen to all of our podcast episodes, watch our Emmy-nominated documentary series, follow us on social media, donate to our nonprofit organization, and more, please visit onegirlrevolution.com. That's the number onegirlrevolution.com.